Okay.
Hello, everybody. My name is David Relevance. I am a master's degree student in human rights and multi-level governance at the University of Padua. I am currently working as an intern here at Sultan University. And today we will be discussing customary law, specifically the changing relevance of customary law in the development of international humanitarian. Now, the reason why I chose this topic is because I am actually currently writing my master's degree thesis about a very similar topic relating to international humanitarian law, specifically when it comes to customary law. So I thought it would be a good idea to do a presentation about this topic. So I start with a quote that's originally from my thesis, actually, which goes, "The line between what constitutes internal affairs with domestic jurisdiction and that which meets the threshold of armed conflict has continued to shrink. However, treaty law and customary law related to international humanitarian law are currently undergoing a period of significant transformation, because the period of transformation we're referring to is the period where customary law is seeming to gain sort of a new relevance that it previously didn't have in the face of its developments in the mid-20th century. So first, we're going to go with that. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that in the 5th century, the king of Sparta did something that was not recommended, still isn't recommended. He killed the ambassador from Persia. And even back then, this was considered something that is not a very good idea to do. Although there were not any actual specific laws or treaties or anything written that they were supposed to do that, it was just assumed you don't do that. But he recognized the wrong that he had committed. So according to Herodotus, he sent 2 of his own ambassadors to the king of Persia and said, "Do with them what you will. So you can kill them, you can torture them, whatever you want. This is just my way of saying I'm sorry." Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately for the ambassadors, the king of Persia said, "I'm not going to simply violate what has become a customary norm, specifically out of retaliation or out of vengeance." He regarded the idea that you don't kill ambassadors as a universal law. And the idea of universal law works very similarly to the concept of our customary laws nowadays, except for universal law wasn't necessarily something written down, but in the idea that it's recognized that you don't do this out of practice. This has become an established norm out of existing practice. So he refused to kill him out of respect for universal law, and this is considered one of the earliest examples, if we believe Herodotus. He has the poems from the fundamental history. One of the first examples of on the historical record of customary norms being applied internationally. So the differences between this case and modern cases is that modern international humanitarian law, when it comes to customary norms, has an emphasis on human rights, the rights of the individual, these sort of things. Obviously, in ancient history, this was not the case. This was a diplomatic issue. It wasn't making the rights issue. So when you look into the 20th century, we can't necessarily compare the 2 histories between each other, but we can see where modern customary norms come from. So into the 20th century, we essentially have the development of the Geneva Conventions in the late 19th century, which then goes to play largely in the 20th century, the Hague Conventions, and later on the additional protocols. And these make up the basis of what we consider now to be universalized humanitarian law. So essentially, beforehand, there was no universal concept or enforcement mechanism to ensure that rules of war was followed, that there was any sort of international, jurisdiction over crimes which were committed on the battlefield, or that there even was such a thing as crimes committed on the battlefield. So these were developments in the 20th century, but then as we get later into the 1990s, we have the outbreak of the wars in Yugoslavia. And this sort of threw the whole idea of international customary law on its head. Because before this, we had certain cases, such as that in Nicaragua, which did establish the customary norms for international humanitarian law, but we saw nothing like what occurred at the International Criminal Tribunal in Yugoslavia, established by the UN Security Council. The reason why this is so unprecedented was because we had what is now considered newly formed types of the definitions of which were still being debated. There's terms such as internationalized armed conflict, and then there's the traditional terms of non-international armed conflict and international armed conflict. So one of the problems with the criminal tribunal is that they had to distinguish between these forms of armed conflict. They also had to establish the idea that there was an armed conflict entirely, and it wasn't just some sort of dispute. One of the issues with this was that the conflict was not just between state actors. It wasn't just one country versus another country, World War II or Korean War scenario. It was essentially made up of militias, state-backed groups, states themselves, and it made the whole situation a lot messier, especially considering that Yugoslavia had just broken up and there was now new independent states which were taking part in the conflict. So in this situation, what evolved from it was something we now consider a rapid evolution of customary law, or as some people consider it, a fast tracking of customary law. And this is essentially where previously disputed, say, definitions of armed conflict and customary law become codified in a sense. They are now official. So one of the most famous cases of this is the Customary case, which occurred prosecuted by the International Criminal Tribunal of Yugoslavia. This occurred in Bosnia in 1992, and he was accused of rape, murder, torture, and various other crimes while he was working with the Bosnian Serb armed forces. This was not necessarily a state, I would say a state army itself. Rather, you could consider it a militant group which has received backing from the state. But this was also one of the disputes which occurred in the court case, whether or not they received state backing, whether or not they acted independently, sort of thing. The Customary case also established the concept that the Hague Conventions were now to be considered customary law in cases of non-international conflict, which was the case before. So it's a number of precedents. Also, one of the most important ones was what constitutes armed conflict itself, whether it's international or non-international. And to do this, the committee of experts on the criminal tribunal decided that in order for something to meet the classification of an armed conflict, it required it to meet a certain level of duration, severity, and structure, along with a few other points which, depending on the characteristics of the conflicts that you brought up. Duration was important, obviously, because even if it's a large-scale, say, outbreak of violence, if it occurs for 2 days, it doesn't necessarily meet the definition of armed conflict. Therefore, the laws of armed conflict, international humanitarian law, will not apply in this situation. If it's a small conflict that's protracted for a long enough period of time, then it can meet the definition, even though it's not necessarily a widespread outburst of violence. We see this with the way the ICC later on would develop their own definition of armed conflict. They also use the term protracted, and they use this as an evolution of the application's own definition. So this was the precedent that was set, and is now always to stay. Also, severity obviously is an important thing. If it's just 5 or 10 militants committing attacks across the country, it's not usually going to meet the definition of severity, which is required in order to be armed conflict. And then structure, say the cohesiveness of the actual belligerents in the involved in violence or involved in the scenarios that are occurring. So, do you have a command structure? Do you have some sort of military backing? Do you have an actual cohesive army unit? Or are you just sort of a loosely dispersed group of people committing acts of violence? These are essential protocols which must be met in order to determine whether or not this qualifies as armed conflict. And these were established during the Tavish case. They had to come up with a way to find what armed conflict was because it's not included specifically enough in the Geneva Conventions or the additional protocols which came after. So this is why the defense for Tavish in this case brought up this dispute that the criminal tribunal doesn't have jurisdiction. He was saying they don't have jurisdiction because this wasn't an armed conflict. And obviously, then the criminal tribunal came up with this series of protocols which must be met, which is how they determined it was an armed conflict. However, the defense also brought up the idea that because there was no violence occurring in specific region where these crimes took place, and there wasn't a conflict going on, that the international humanitarian law does not apply. However, this was also rejected by the prosecution on the basis that it's already been established that it does not matter if there is no armed conflict occurring in this region, it matters if it's occurring in the territory, which it was at the time. And so ultimately, Customary was prosecuted for war crimes and for crimes against humanity. But this set a precedent which we still go on when it comes to defining what is an armed conflict, also whether it's international or non-international. Because, for instance, the Bosnian Serb armed forces did receive some form of backing from the Serbian state, it was found out later, as well as the Republic of Srpska army was also being backed by the state, which is how they determined that this could be this could fit the definition of an international conflict. This part specifically was also more complicated by the fact that the committee of experts initially stated that all of Yugoslavia was involved in an international conflict. However, this was disputed by the appeals court afterwards, which said that there were both international and non-international, as well as internal conflicts occurring in different parts of Yugoslavia at the time. However, this did not change what became customary law, which is decisions that were made during that case. When it comes to universality, this is sort of where customary law starts to shine in the modern context. The international order is becoming increasingly polarized. It is almost impossible nowadays to establish universal treaties when it comes to international humanitarian law. For instance, even when it comes to the ICC has significant backing, the majority of states back it, but it's still not universal. And this was the largest undertaking in recent times to establish a widespread universal international humanitarian law treaty. And it seems if this one couldn't even get to a universal state, it's unlikely, as the world becomes more polarized, that we will see any treaty be able to establish a universal precedent. However, we'll get more into the ICC and its universality later on this presentation. But this is where a lack of new treaties leads customary law to pick up pieces. Because if, say, we come across a conflict and there's clearly conflict being committed, but we can't find a way to prosecute these individuals on the basis of existing treaties, this is where customary law becomes essential. It's the only way to create new progress in the field of international humanitarian law on a universal basis. If we don't rely on customary law, then essentially we're going nowhere in terms of progressing international humanitarian law. But we come into situations when it comes to state sovereignty. A lot of states don't like the idea of having not new laws, but essentially new standards that they have to live up to if they don't specifically vote for them. We're going to talk about that further later. So now we're going to talk about Sudan, because Sudan is an interesting case when it comes specifically to the ICC, and when it comes to sort of the new way that treaty law and customary law are exchanged and how they work alongside each other. So, for instance, in Sudan, we all know that in Darfur, in southern Sudan, in the 2000s, there was a significant number of crimes committed, genocide, mass killings, torture, abuse, etc. There were allegations that the state was behind some of the militias who were carrying out a lot of these acts, and according to multiple court documents, they were responsible for a lot of them. The issue was that Sudan as a state is not prosecuting those responsible, largely because a lot of those responsible were some of the highest ranking members of the Sudanese government, including the president. So the UN Security Council saw this as an issue. It is an issue, right? There has to be prosecution for war crimes, for genocide, and stuff like this. But how do you get a state to be willing and open to use its own judicial institutions to prosecute its own president? Normally, what the UN Security Council would do is what it did in Yugoslavia, what it did in Rwanda, what it did in Sierra Leone, which is establish some sort of court, a criminal tribunal, its own individual case for that country, for that conflict. However, on the arguments that it would be too costly and take too much time, the UN Security Council voted to do something that is unprecedented. They voted to give the ICC jurisdiction inside of Sudan, despite Sudan not being a member of the ICC. So Sudan never actually ratified the Rome Statute. They're not a member of the ICC. And as ICC is a treaty body, if you are not a signatory to the treaty, theoretically, you are not supposed to be bound by the laws of this treaty. This is the idea of sovereignty in your own personal jurisdiction. However, the Rome Statute has a clause in it which specifies that the UN Security Council can call upon it at any time when it sees fit, if it needs assistance. And since the UN itself is a treaty body, which is ratified by Sudan, they are a member of the UN. The UN does technically have the authority to call upon the ICC to have jurisdiction within Sudan, despite Sudan not being a member of the ICC. The reason this is unprecedented is because essentially you have a universal treaty body that is forcing a non-universal treaty upon members who've never signed that treaty. This has far-reaching implications, one of which is that when a criminal tribunal creates customary law, they're largely doing it on the basis of the Geneva Conventions, which are established universal law. So there's no dispute over that. It's not necessarily controversial. But when they're also using other state and court examples, but it's largely based on the Geneva Conventions. So when the ICC is creating customary law, their statute is the Rome Statute. This is a treaty body. It's not universally recognized like in the conventions. In this instance, so far the ICC has only stuck to existing customary law in its dealing with Sudan. So it's not the problem of what it has done, it's the problem of what it theoretically could do, what it has the authority to do now that it's been granted this authority by the UN Security Council. So for instance, if the ICC wanted to apply one of its provisions of the Rome Statute as customary law in the case of Sudan, legally it could. There's nothing stopping it. And if it does, that would then become customary law. So it would be creating customary law on off of non-universal treaty law. While again, it's not actively doing this, the idea that legally it can do this is what sets the new precedent. Sudan is not very happy with this decision, as can be imagined, having a treaty forced upon it that it did not sign. Other states have shown also significant opposition to this idea that The UN essentially can come in and enforce whatever they want upon states just because they are members of the United Nations. So this has been a very recent development, and there's not a lot of, let's say, historical precedents to go off of to gauge an idea of how this might affect the future of international humanitarian law. It's something that's being followed very closely. But it really has changed the course of scholarly debate over how exactly we can create customary law in the future. It doesn't have to be based on universal treaty law anymore, as long as the universal treaty body accepts non-universal treaty law, we can create customary law essentially out of anything. The fact that it hasn't happened doesn't mean that legally it now can't happen. Then we get to the issue of colonialism. This is an issue when it comes to major international institutions in general. Specifically, if we go back to the Bangkok Declaration in 1993, mainly Eastern and Southeast Asian states came together to basically emphasize the idea that they support human rights universality. They like this idea. However, there are some issues. Mainly those issues are that current international human rights institutions, international humanitarian law, and current customary law practices are based very much on more of a Judeo-Western sort of philosophical basis. These institutions were mostly created at the end of World War II, when a lot of these countries were still colonial holdings. Even the ones that weren't colonial holdings were still just coming out of their colonial shell. They didn't necessarily have the prowess internationally to exert their own influence over the developments of what would become modern international institutions. So the Bangkok Declaration was saying that there really needs to be a focus on ensuring that not just enforcement is universal, but also creation and interpretation is universal, so that future human rights laws and institutions take into consideration the cultural beliefs and practices of other countries outside of Western European, American, Judeo-Christian backgrounds. This also brought about the issue of sovereignty, because for them, a lot of them again works around the development of these institutions. And so for them, they didn't really feel like they had a choice, especially when it comes to joining organizations such as the United Nations. If your country became independent in the 1960s, you didn't have a say on how the United Nations was created, but essentially you had to join, or else you wouldn't be able to participate in the international system. So the idea of having these international treaty bodies that they essentially have to be part of, but they don't have any say in their creation, strikes a very sour taste in the mouth of a lot of these countries, especially when we get into the context of neo-colonialism, because even though they are no longer held to, say, a colonial status directly, they're not controlled by other countries, they don't feel like they have an equal footing on the global stage, or that their, say, inputs really have as much influence as the inputs of older, more historical, maybe Western European members of the United Nations and other international bodies. So when it comes to customary law, if customary law is based on existing treaty bodies, it means that you're creating customary law off of essentially treaties that a lot of these countries didn't have any input on. So they also feel that customary law may be more, as we would say, Eurocentric, as opposed to more inclusive to local countries. And there's a series of implications which come from this. One of which is the idea that if we go back to universality, is that parts of the breakdown in universality is the emergence of other perspectives when it comes to international humanitarian law. So now when you get these diverse opinions from former colonial holdings, from different cultures from different countries, who previously didn't have a say. So maybe it was easier to create universal treaty law historically, because you have more culturally homogenous bodies coming together to form it. You didn't have as much possible consent. Nowadays, obviously, it's also politicized. So you have multiple reasons why universal treaty laws are unlikely to come about. But there are some potential problems with having an over reliance on customary law. For instance, I mean, since universalization has lost significant support, the customary law has left to pick up pieces. If customary law is becoming the new universal law, taking over the place of treaty law, it's going to be looked down upon just as universal treaty laws. Essentially, states are becoming more emboldened to resist international bodies from affecting their own sovereign decision-making capacities. So, if you are a country like the United States, you will not join the ICC because you have a historical legacy of not wanting international oversight into your own judicial proceedings. Not just judicial proceedings, but also the way you act internationally. A lot of the major countries who conduct warfare who engage in international combat, such as the US, Russia, Turkey, etc. None of these countries are members of the ICC, for instance. They don't necessarily want the liability which comes upon having increased responsibilities on the state. So when we start to talk about customary law becoming universal, the problem is that we over rely on it too much. We're going to start facing more and more resistance to customary law itself. So if currently treaty law is unusable and we start only using customary law in our enforcement of international humanitarian law, you're going to start seeing more of a disregard of customary. You already see it to an extent in certain conflicts like in Syria, where you have a variety of armed conflicts going on at the same time. International armed conflict, non-international armed conflict, internal conflict, and internal disturbances all happening at the same time, which is what gives it the moniker as being an internationalized non-international conflict. Customary law is included more in all of these instances by pretty much every party involved. And so what exactly is the future of international humanitarian law? As it stands right now, it's definitely not universalized treaty law. It's partially reliance on customary law, but also it's going to involve a continued mix of both, as we saw in the case of Sudan. The problem is that more than likely, when it comes to all forms of international humanitarian law, there's going to be increased resistance by all states as they see fit, as they seek to lessen the amount of international jurisdiction on their own side. So that's what I'm here to discuss. If there are any questions, I know it's kind of a lot. It's a mouthful, a lot to take in.
That's great. Thank you, Jacob. I mean, like listening to you. And thank you for being with us. Maybe, I mean, this is not my subject, I mean, expertise, but maybe I will leave the floor to those who are interested in international humanitarian law, whatever. But I have just one question. So, I mean, you mentioned Sudan case, Bosnian case, some others, but how about Palestine? I mean, maybe there is the issue probably. Whether it is international, non-international, it's like a very torn issue.
I think the reason why I think I go to Palestine is because there hasn't necessarily been a criminal tribunal or a specific thing. I mean, I know there's other international exceptions and not courts, but bodies that are able to do Palestine when it comes to law, but none of them necessarily have had an influence on customary law as it's being created. So that's why I didn't bring it up. Obviously, it's still a relevant case in the idea that it involves non-international armed conflict, international armed conflict, internal disturbances, pretty much every form of conflict possible. but also because of its political sensitivity, it's almost impossible to really get, let's say, some sort of criminal tribunal formed for it, or some sort of ICC prosecution. I also believe Israel is also not a part of the ICC. Palestine definitely is not a part of the ICC. So technically the UN Security Council could ask the ICC to go in there, but I highly doubt, based on the makeup of the Security Council, that there's any chance that they will ask the ICC to go to Palestine, and even if they did, there's not really much jurisdiction they could do. There's not much physical on-the-ground change that could occur. So when it comes to Palestine, unfortunately, in the case of international humanitarian law, because of so many roadblocks in the process of implementing international humanitarian law when it comes to other states and international institutions and restrictions that are placed upon them, it's unlikely that we're going to get to the real kind of enforcement measures. I mean, the UN repeatedly votes to condemn Israel over its treatment of Palestine, but past condemnation, there's not really much material, you should say, solution that can come from that. Obviously, I can't stand up here and give a solution to the Israel-Palestine conflict as much as I would like to. It's probably out of the scope of the question at the moment. But I mean, definitely, all forms of armed conflict and necessary law do apply to the case of Palestine. It's just that because of the lack of political, not willpower, but ability by international institutions, the conflict itself hasn't represented any significant shift in customary law, so it's not often brought up in the discussion of the developments of customary law when it comes to international humanitarian law. But it's a very relevant case.
Yeah, thank you, Jacob. This was really like you said, this is the beginning of your research, but I think it was already a terrific presentation. Thank you so much. One thing I was left wondering was, I was somewhat confused as to the relevance of the customary law, because you hinted toward two things. First, if I'm not misunderstanding what you have said, is the creation of new customary law in addressing these questions. And the second is the increased relevance of customary law as a fallback position. As treaty law is not universalized, since states don't sign these treaties, then customary law picks up pieces and what's left over. So these two things, it strikes me, are quite different. The first one seems to be an effort to create new customary law, which I think is an incredibly huge undertaking. The first example you have started with is Thucydides, Herodotus, all the way from the Spartans. And I think the interesting thing about what you have said is that customary law takes quite a long time to establish. Something like diplomatic immunity and other sort of like treaties must be served, pacta sunt servanda. All these kinds of things are established precisely because there is long-term practice. There is long-term observance of these practices all across the board. But in the case that you mentioned, for example, in Sudan, that United Nations Security Council can, in theory, authorize ICC to have jurisdiction, then this looks like an attempt to create customary law. But in order for us to call it customary law, isn't it a requirement to see it being practiced for a long time and having established? That's where I'm a little bit confused.
Not prior example, you say.
Yeah, because that's first effort to do it.
It's normal to be confused because historically, you're correct, the customary law is based off of practices in the past that have just continued and become established norms. When we talk about other forms of international law, this is the case, like maritime law and stuff like this. It's based on these new practices. This is sort of where things got tricky with the criminal tribunal in Yugoslavia, because that's why I mentioned before that they developed what's called the fast tracking of customary law. So essentially, you're not basing it off of existing practice, you're creating customary law based off of what you interpret the meaning of existing conventions or existing treaties to have. So you're assuming essentially that when the Geneva Conventions define armed conflict as this, one definition, but that definition doesn't fit modern conflicts, you're expanding upon that definition and saying, well, assuming, I guess, this is where the controversy comes in, that this is what they intended when they originally wrote the treaty. But we're just sort of rewording it for a modern context in order to fit modern conflicts and calling this customary law. So customary law in this situation is essentially just, how would you say, not rewriting, but reinterpreting existing treaty law. When it comes to international humanitarian law, essentially this is how they are defining customary law. So when I talked about the Tavish case, historically, with the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols, there was no actual specific definition for what an armed conflict is. It was essentially just, I think the idea was widespread violence, or something like this was the original definition. And so they had to be more specific, because also the Geneva Conventions, it does make a distinction between international armed conflict and non-international armed conflict. And it tries to specify that, say, a riot is not considered non-international armed conflict. It doesn't meet the definition of armed conflict yet, because it's not large enough scale. But a civil war does meet the definition of non-international conflict. But there has to be a distinction between them. The problem with that is that in modern conflicts, it's not as clear cut, right? You might have states backing independent rebel groups in the country, or then fighting other rebel groups. That group might be fighting a state, and that state might be blah blah blah, etc. And so what they had to do is adapt to the Geneva Conventions, additional protocols, definitions to meet modern conflicts, and they consider that customary law. Because they say, I think the original reason why they consider this customary law in the term as it's used in other branches of international law is because they say in practice, this is what the Geneva Conventions meant. So this is what they were practicing. They just didn't have a chance to apply it in this type of situation yet. And so we're just being more specific, and this is customary law. It's very difficult when you compare it to something like international maritime law or other aspects of international law, because it's not based on, it's not entirely based on a historical precedent. Sometimes it is. Like if we go to the case of Nicaragua, or when we talk about recognizing belligerent actors in conflicts, like I know the British recognition of the Confederate States during the US Civil War is something that's still brought up when it comes to international humanitarian law in defining what is a belligerent actor in conflict. And that would also be considered customary law in the traditional sense, that it's based off consistent practice. But in this sense, fast track customary law is essentially just reinterpreting historical treaty law, existing treaty law. And it is very complicated. And then, like when it comes to the ICC case, it's not that the UN is giving them, asking them to create customary law. They're really just asking them to say, implement existing customary law. But in doing so, they also have the authority to create customary law if they so wanted to. But so far, the precedent hasn't been set where they have done that so far.
Can I follow up on that point? The reason I'm asking this is because in the establishment of customary law, for example, the reason why a customary law is binding on states is because there is existing practice. There is a long time observance of the practice, and then the opposition, the contestation of a state of this of any customary law in that sense, say diplomatic immunity, doesn't hold because that's already thought to be an established thing. But when it comes to treaty law, you can even in emerging customary law, a state can oppose the practice, and there are examples in international law where states actually do not accept the newly emerging custom, and they claim to be staying outside of that newly emerging norm or practice or custom. In that case, for example, what will happen if the Sudanese authorities say we don't recognize this custom? Then the customary law, yeah, they did, and then the customary law then would fall back on treaty law. It will, the difference between customary law and treaty law, at least one difference is that there is not much way for a state to oppose customary law, because that's already thought to be an established custom. But treaty law, you can not sign it, or you can challenge it, contest it in different ways. But since this is an unprecedented new custom, a state doesn't have to recognize it. It's not established. And then when you contest it, it becomes almost unequal to treaty law.
The problem is that this was granted by a UN Security Council resolution. Sudan doesn't have the authority to go against it.
Was it granted on the Sudanese case?
Yeah.
The UN Security Council authorized?
Yeah, it's the UN Security Council resolution which established the ICC to go into Sudan.
And China and Russia did not veto it?
I mean, at least one of them did. Because they passed the Security Council resolution went through.
So it passed, huh?
Yeah, this was in the early 2000s. So this is what makes it tricky, essentially, because they have to abide by it. It's the UN Security Council resolution. It's not something that you can deny because it's customary law. It's not customary law to send the ICC into Sudan. That's based on treaty, based on the UN Security Council resolution, which is based on the UN, which is a treaty. You know? But it's rather, and I think this was where it really got controversial, was because it was the idea that we're just going to skip the whole idea of implementing new treaties or doing anything like that. Here's this existing treaty that you're not a part of, but you're part of our treaty. So we can say, now you're part of this treaty, essentially. And that's why there's been no real legal, how would you say, argument against it. I mean, people have argued against it in terms of violating sovereignty, but there's been no real solid argument of why the UN can't do that, you know. But the worry, obviously, is that the UN is kind of going beyond its original intent, and that nobody joined the UN with the idea that the UN could then force other treaties upon it. But they can't, essentially. The UN, Sudan did try multiple times to sort of get the ICC to go away. It didn't work. The main mission of the ICC originally, when it went into Sudan, was not to carry out its own prosecutions. It was to essentially help the Sudanese establish their own judicial capabilities so that the Sudanese government could prosecute the people in itself who were accused of war crimes against humanity. The problem is that when the president is one of those accused of committing crimes, the courts which are established are complete joke. You know, they're not they're just taking reports. So this is where the ICC had to pick up one jurisdiction and started having some cases. The other problem is that the ICC can't actually go into Sudan and arrest people. The Sudanese authorities have to be the ones who send their own president to the ICC for trial, which obviously is going to happen. Which is also why people argue, then why didn't you just take the extra time and establish a criminal tribunal? It would have been a lot less messier, it would have been a lot less legally complicated, it would have created a lot less problems. But I mean, it happened, it's in the past, so it's there. And again, you have to emphasize the idea that the ICC did not go to Sudan and enforce its own statute, therefore creating a customary. It just has the legal ability to do so now, if it wants. And that's sort of the problem, is that nobody thinks that the ICC is going to start enforcing the own statute on people who are part of the ICC. But the idea that they legally can, and that if they do, it creates customary law, that's the issue. So it's a complex case, which is why there's probably only a handful of papers that actually exist about it right now. It's very hard to find very relevant information regarding it, especially the repercussions of it. I actually found one paper about it that was actually detailed enough to matter, and it still didn't have as much as I wanted in it. It was a paper by the International Review for the Red Cross. And so I emailed the author of the paper, and I went on the tangent about, well, you know, if the ICC decided to do this, if they then have customary law, but if they do it, it would still be recognized by the rest of the country, even though it's blah blah blah. And the author confirmed that they can. I was very confused. It was almost impossible to actually find an answer to this question about if the ICC has authority from the U.S. Security Council, can it now create customary law from their own statute if it wants to? And I couldn't find the answer on or I didn't use this paper or anything. So I emailed the international law professor who's also going to the Red Cross Review Board, and he answered my question. And I was right, which is good because I was going crazy trying to find the answer to this question.
Thank you for saying this. I was also thinking about relevance with the customer law, which is very tight of presentation. But especially when it comes to some more recent challenges or developments. You rightly emphasize the changing nature of conflicts, armed conflicts, the changing wars, new wars. This is a central issue affecting national and international bodies. But there are also some more recent challenges like cyber warfare, autonomous weapons, pandemics, and this kind of challenges. And when it comes to these issues, then I particularly wonder about the relevance of customary law, because as has already become clear, customary law relies on established, consistent, long-standing or ongoing practices of states. But those states have practices, established practices in face of these challenges. These issues make its relevance furthermore complicated. I think. Yeah. The nature of warfare is changing, okay, but there are more recent and hard to define challenges. So in what way could customary law adjust to these challenges? Okay, can it still be a source or resource to tackle these issues?
I think
This is one. The second question of perhaps observation is about one sentence in your very last slide. You refer to emboldened, recently more emboldened attitude of states. So, from my undergraduate years, I remember talks about the decline of nation state, globalization. This is the end of the nation state form, supranational bodies, subnational entities. But now
It's the opposite.
there is a comeback of nation states, it is resurgence of nation states. I discovered that in earlier decades of the 20th century, several international lawyers or scholars also talked about the end of the nation state. The age of the nation state is over. Carl Schmitt, a notorious case, for instance. And then he turned to the issue of broad wider spaces. Politics is now operating, it is getting realized in larger spaces. So the classical European nation state form is over. But now we are, this is like a wave, perhaps. This is perhaps the second wave or the third wave of nation states. So how would you evaluate this from the standpoint of international law, as a student of international law?
I think for the first part of the question, I think we have to remember the key distinction between international law, international humanitarian law, because like when we talk about things like cybersecurity, all these sorts of things, and also how customary law works in those cases, it's separate from the body of international humanitarian law. So international humanitarian law, we're talking about laws of war and stuff, but largely not when it comes to, say, what are the rules if you attack my energy grid or something like that. I mean, okay, unless we're talking about stealing rights, but that's simple. Because customary law, when it comes to international humanitarian law, as we were saying before, now the precedent has been set that it can be fast tracked. So it's evolving, it can evolve just as a fast conflict evolves essentially. It depends on the international institutions which are willing to, you know, let's say, put forth the bodies that have the ability to change customary law. If we're talking about customary law in just general international law, then we are basing it off of social precedent, which is going to make it very hard to adapt to modern changes in warfare. You know, yeah, I mean, just the one we mentioned before, pandemic, cyber, et cetera, So I would say the relevance of customary law in both cases is important. But the reason why I specify customary law and international humanitarian law is because although historically it's been the opposite, it's been the slow-moving body of law. Nowadays, it's the fast-moving body of law. Nowadays, customary law can be established just upon any court's decision. But of course, it can't just be laws on the bill. Like it has to be laws based on existing treaties, precedents, etc. And it has to be granted the authority by a relevant institution, preferably a universal institution. So I think its relevance nowadays is important, especially in the case of when we're talking about trading Texas conflicts, because as we said before, there's not going to be any universal treaties that are going to come about more than likely, which regulate the use of AI in cyber attacks or something like that. It's highly doubtful. There's probably going to be treaties, not universal treaties. And also when I talk about international humanitarian law, and I talk about lack of universalization, I am not talking about every type of treaty in the world. I do think that, you know, there are climate treaties, things like this, which do gain widespread support and do have the possibility of being universalized. I'm talking specifically about international humanitarian law treaties, right? Ones that govern rules of war, ones that govern treaty people combat, ones that have the potential to sacrifice the state's own sovereignty. Because anything that does that is pretty much impossible to pass it, I guess. So, I mean, I guess I don't know how to further define what relevance I think it plays. Obviously, it has some. I don't know if I can be specific. I don't know about. I know there are specific treaties being passed around when it comes to cyber cybercrime, cyber attacks. But again, I don't think any of them are really going to be based on customary law, because like if it's customary law with that's supposed to be universalized, I don't see it being possible. I don't see the UN Security Council agreeing to create some sort of tribunal which regulates its which will establish the universal customary law. Even if they do, I don't see it being followed. So in that case, I don't think that new types of conflict necessarily are going to be regulated well by customary law, but I think that they will face more. They're more likely to have customary laws and regulation than treaty law. I guess it's one of those things in the future. I can't really guess what's going to happen. I mean, we could have guessed that the UN Security Council was going to ask the ICC to go stand, right, and revolutionize treaty law. That was completely just came out of nowhere. So I mean, in the future, we will see exactly how it plays out. For the second question, that one is also different. It's a mixture, right? Because we see in some situations that states become more emboldened and more independent. Particularly Russia, China, and US. You know, they have less interest in participating in international treaties when it comes to things like international humanitarian law, things governing their own sovereignty. Same with smaller states. You know, India is becoming more independent, South Africa is becoming more independent. They're acting in their own foreign policy interests, their own domestic policy interests as well. However, you do see institutions like the EU. Certain states in the EU are claiming to be more independent, but you see more countries enter the EU than leave the EU. You know, in the past 5-10 years, right? The UK left, but that's the UK. They come and go, they do what they want. They're almost as bad as the French when it comes to this. And there's only more countries that want to do it, right? So I think it's a mixed bag. Some countries are still willing to sort of exchange sovereignty for security, trade guarantees, this sort of thing, while other countries aren't. I think it's looking more like the bigger countries with the more economic and say military potential, also with the larger populations, are the ones who are expressing their sovereignty more expressively. They're being more outward about it, and they're claiming their independence more steadfastly. Whereas I think smaller countries are sort of doing the opposite. They're kind of wanting to join up, make allies and treaties, probably in the face of having neighbors that are expressing themselves more. Smaller countries want to be part of larger groups, essentially maybe to ensure their own sovereignty or to ensure their own security guarantee. I mean, NATO is constantly growing, EU is growing. There's different, I would say, Asian.
That's it.
Exactly. Which is, I mean, not necessarily growing anymore, but it's economically, militarily, they're increasing their cooperation with each other more and more every year. So I think the idea of the end of the nation state, I mean, we can say it was a little idealistic, but we can also say it's the same thing again in some of the, oh, it's the end of the Cold War, it's going to be global peace. There's never going to be this 100% this and 100% that. I think we see the return of the nation state to an extent, but I also think we see the growth of, how would you say, supranational, you know, just the growth of international cohesiveness in certain cases as well. It really just depends on that context of history. You're not going to see too much of one or the other to an extent. Big states are always going to want to be more independent. Small states are always going to want to have some sort of relationship to keep them independent politically. And whatever form that takes, that's the form it takes. You know, I don't think it's ever going to be one way or the other.
Thank you. Any questions from the online? Yes.
One final, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting because it's not my field. So it was really interesting. Since you say that this will be your master's, in what terms your study or your research will make contribution to the field, to this field, or to the development of this?
That was a major issue when I was starting to write about this topic, because I was thinking, how do I frame this, you know, in a way which can contribute to the literature? And what I've come down to, sort of what my last slide hints at, is what is the future of international humanitarian law in a changing global order? So it's less focused specifically on customary law or treaty law, and focused on what direction is international humanitarian law heading in general. Because I see there's a lot of papers which mention sort of what's the current state of this, what could be the future of that. But it's been very difficult for me to find relevant modern academic papers, which take into consideration all of the recent events that have happened when it comes to international humanitarian law, and combine them to create some sort of outlook on the future. Because, like I said, when I was talking about the Sudan case, there's very few resources compared to, say, the Tavish case. Tavish case is the most famous when it comes to modern customary law. So there's thousands of pages about it. When it came to Sudan, I could barely find a handful, and most of them weren't really answering the questions I was looking for. And so I thought, if I can't find papers which answer the question that I have, then I should probably try and write the paper, you know, that can answer this question, because obviously it doesn't exist in its entirety. And I realized when I was talking to other international law professors and scholars about it, they didn't have the answers to a lot of the questions I had either. When I would ask them to them, they would go, well, I mean, technically, yes, I guess, but I never really thought about that. And I thought, well, if they haven't thought about it, and these are the experts, well, then maybe this is the perfect thing to write a thesis about, to do the research and get the forefront of the discussion. Obviously, you can type in the future of international humanitarian law, and you will get some articles and things like this, but I don't think they actually take into account the current predicament that international humanitarian law is in, and really bring up relevant modern examples in order to create their own vision for the future. So I think that's why I decided, or that would be the contribution.
So you also. Anyone those online? Maybe can you see any question or comment? No. Okay. Thank you for your time. We appreciate the exacting presentation. Thank you very much.